All right, recording's going. So cheers to a good interview.
Yeah.
Um, Today we're joined by a familiar face, someone you may or may not know. We have Mr. Myers from our very own AGL. Mr. Myers teaches earth science and AP environmental science at AGL, so I'm sure you're familiar with him. But what
Hi,
you might
y'all.
not be familiar with is his life before teaching as a geologist. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. Myers just to kind of like introduce himself, not as your teacher, but as a geologist.
So, hi, everybody. Y'all probably already know that I grew up in Kentucky. Um, I pretty much grew up in like the one town where there was a university in Kentucky, Lexington. So I didn't want to go to the one university in my hometown and also home state. So I went to the University of Chicago. I swear to God, this was not on purpose. People who had me today in class can tell you I was already wearing this.
So I
Um,
just want to be clear, Louisville is not a college in Kentucky.
where?
Exactly. Okay, moving on.
It's a joke because, in case anyone doesn't get it, UK, Louisville, don't get along.
Okay.
So yeah, I went to U Chicago, and I went in knowing I wanted to study geology. Um, Specifically, I was always super into space. Like I was a huge space nerd. I went to space camp a lot growing up, and not like the cool space camp in Florida, like the janky one in Alabama. Um, it was great.
So tell me about Space Camp, because that's something that is like a running joke, but people don't really know what it means. So let's actually talk
Right.
about what Space Camp is and why you wanted to do that.
So it's basically like they have camps at like various places across America that have like important facilities related to America's space program. So like the one in Florida is at Cape Canaveral, where we launch all of our rockets from. There's one in Texas in Houston where the command and control center is. There's one in California at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is where a lot of like the aeronautics end of the National Air and Space Administration comes in. And the one in Alabama is at the Goddard Rocket Center. So that one's really focused more on rocket science than on like astronauting. That's where they like built a lot of the early rockets and still like do assembly on like booster rockets for well, I guess not still, when they still had space shuttles, that was where they did assembly for like space shuttle booster rockets, along with a lot of the rockets we use to launch satellites that are still public, not owned by private companies.
So when you did Space Camp, that sounds like kind of a leap from Space Camp to geology. So how do you connect those things?
Well, I think the part about space that was always cool to me were the other planets in our solar system. I read a book that I thought was going to be like a little kid's book. It might actually be behind me. I might be able to go get it.
A little show and tell action.
Yeah, I don't see it right away. I think I might have already taken it down to show.
I can edit out a minute if you want to go grab the book.
No, honestly, I don't know where it is.
This is great TV.
Thank you. Right, me looking behind me at a bookshelf. But basically, it's all about the geologic history of Mars, and like I was super into it, and I just always really like the part about space that interests me wasn't deep space. It wasn't like stars and cosmology and the like deep history of the universe. It was the close to home solar system, and probe missions, and kind of the chance to like something I say in earth science sometimes is that like the earth is an experiment we've only run once. You can't really do experimental science with the history of the earth because there are no other trials, except there are other trials. There are the other planets in our solar system. And understanding how they've developed is our best way of understanding like what different variables allowed the earth to be a place where life evolved.
A unique way to look at that study.
Yeah. I know.
Well, what I mean is that maybe it doesn't feel like unique to you, but that's the first time that someone has said that to me and phrased it like that. Because the truth is that like as humans, we are inherently self-centered, like not just in our own lives, but also in our view of the world and assuming that we are kind of the center of life and how things happen. And we don't tend to look outside of our own little sphere of influence to how things develop and how things occur. So it is a unique perspective.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. I think I'm too deep into it. Like you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I went to the University of Chicago because it has its geology program is really into cosmochemistry,
Okay.
which
So
is like,
you gotta explain that term.
yeah, so that's the study basically of the chemical makeup and like interactions in space, basically in free floating space. Specifically, they're most focused on like the chemistry inside the early solar system. So like UChicago has the world's largest collection of meteorites. Um, and they do a lot of like studying like composition of and like molecular structure of elements at really bizarre pressures. So like either super low pressure in space or really high pressure in the center of planets.
So the meteors that they have there are so that they can the conditions, the chemical conditions of space are kind of preserved on these meteors. So if we
Right.
collect them when they fall to Earth and we can study them, we can study what space is like or what planets are like elsewhere out of the solar system.
Yeah, and we kind of think that meteors spread into like two different groups. There's a group of like chunks that never got big. So like planetesimals that were just like always very small, never grew particularly large, were just pushed out by the gravity of Jupiter into the asteroid belt. And then we think
Planetesimals? You want to define that?
planetesimals, meaning like itty bitty baby planets, the little particles of dust that first started to collect together from the planetary disk that weren't either lucky or unfortunate enough to get sucked into something bigger and become part of a true planet.
Cool.
On the other hand, the other half of the asteroids we think are former planets that just blew up, got hit by something really big and just shattered into a million pieces. So because of that, you had differentiated bodies, meaning bodies with like a crust, a mantle, and a core that blew up. So you can find that way samples of the core from a planet that was probably pretty similar to ours.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that way you have a proxy for like the chemical composition of our own planet's core.
So let me summarize what brought you to studying geology at UChicago. You're a space nerd as a child, and you love space. But you're more specifically fascinated with the other planets in our solar system and what we can learn from them about Earth. So what do? You go to UChicago, where they have tons of meteorites. These meteorites have fallen out of space, and they preserve little bits of chemical history of maybe the planet that they came from when a planet collapsed and exploded or broke apart, or from just bits of outer space where dust collected into something that didn't quite become a planet but then crashed into Earth. So you have all these bits of space preserved in rocks that you're studying at UChicago.
Right. And at UChicago, I knew what I wanted. I was not like hunting around for a major. Normally you don't start like for any of the science classes, you're like in major introductory course until your sophomore year. Freshman year is all like kind of what we call the common core. So like take your math, your calculus classes, your English classes. And you don't really start your major till your sophomore year. But I like emailed a professor I wanted to work with who taught the intro course and was like, I want to start intro freshman year. And he was like, you're going to have to bring a chair from another classroom. I was like, fine. And I did.
It's I'm sure that our seniors can relate to that as they're thinking about their majors and what they want to do right now. So they can relate to that. But it's interesting. There's a lot of times when you're in high school, you kind of like are forced to decide at 17, 18 years old, like what you want to do, like potentially for the rest of your life. And most of them change. And you and I are examples of people who ultimately did change our finish line. So, so you're in UChicago, but let's not get to there yet. You're in UChicago.
Yeah.
You're studying meteorites. You're like gung ho from the jump. So what kind of stuff did you do at UChicago as a geologist?
So obviously I took a bunch of classes, but outside of that class, I actually ended up working in the lab of that professor I emailed on like the first day to get into his intro class, a guy named Andy Campbell. And shout out Andy Campbell and Don Hines, Campbell Hines High Pressure Physics Lab. They had a name for that lab that I don't want to say on this video don't worry about it.
Anyway.
Doesn't matter. So, wait, can you edit it out?
It's going to be a pain in the butt, but yeah, I can.
Never mind, I'll tell you later. So, basically that lab was all about, it was a little more focused on like the interior of our Earth and examining it through proxies. It was a mineral physics lab. So what that meant is we were
So
focused on
by
like the high.
proxies, you mean like a meteorite that isn't from here, but relates and we can study it proximity. Yeah, right.
I guess it was more modeling. So we worked with our main device was something called a diamond anvil cell.
Cool.
And our goal was to try to figure out what different common like compounds and minerals are doing at the pressures and temperatures in the deep, deep Earth and the deep interior of other planets. I was specifically focused on the Mars, like kind of like core mantle boundary.
Okay, so we've moved on from your meteorite study at this point. Okay.
Yes, and that was like the main thing they did there, but they did a lot around like the physics and chemistry of like planets. But yeah, I honestly kind of just found work in a professor who would let me work in their lab.
It's kind of what we all do in college.
Yeah, right. Like just I recommend to any seniors, if you're interested in working in a lab, do what I did. Just email a bunch of professors and are like, I'm interested in whatever you do. I don't know. Let me work in your lab, please. And I was really glad I did. So we took 2 diamonds, since that's the hardest mineral. We would take a little flake of whatever material we were studying. We would put it between the 2 diamonds in this little contraption that's basically like a little box with screws. And because the diamonds have very, very, very small, like a couple microns across, like maybe 100 microns across tops, the bevels, but tops, you could just tighten the screws and get up to like a megapascal, which is 1 billion pascals. For reference, the air pressure around you is about 700 pascals. And then we would flip it on its side, and also diamonds, in addition to being really hard, are clear. So we would shoot a laser through it and heat it up to Earth's interior temperature. It's already at Earth's interior pressure. And then we would bring it to this contraption at the Argonne National Laboratory called the, we just called it the beamline.
I was going to say, you did work there, right?
I did work there, and it's kind of embarrassing. Oh, a synchrotron. Right, we bring it to a synchrotron, which just powers up electrons. It's basically an electron accelerator, and use the high energy electrons to perform X-ray diffraction inside of this system that's heated and hyperpressurized to look at the molecular structure of the materials when they're at Earth's pressure temperature conditions.
So you spent a long time talking about that, and
yeah.
you went all the way up. You used all the time. Yeah. So let me paraphrase, right?
Yeah.
So you take a tiny flake of mineral, rock, whatever it is you're studying.
Oh yeah, you squeeze it real hard. You heat it up a lot with a big laser.
You shoot it with the laser, and then you look really close at what it's doing.
Exactly. And basically, we had a giant building that was like pentagon, like it was a huge building that's whole job was to make a really tiny little particle that would let us actually look at that mineral inside of the cell. And we couldn't look at it directly. What it really did was it like just spit out a bunch of math, and then we had to convert that math into like a picture of what was going on.
Yeah.
It wasn't like a microscope.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. It was just whiz bang science. Like I got to spend a lot of time like programming a laser, and like literally I got to like crush up rubies, spread them over a diamond. One time the diamonds blew up. Diamonds blowing up at like a gigapascal sounds like thunder. Like it's loud.
You said gigapascal, and you also compared the pressure of these diamonds, and you compared it to the pressure of the air around you. And like, that's not a comparison we can make, right? Like we're talking about things like giga, like that's not a scale that we can even comprehend. So, but like the important part is that you were pressing these diamonds together with the equivalent force of the pressure at the center of the Earth.
Exactly.
So like hundreds of thousands of miles of rock and dirt above you would be the equivalent to this. So, yeah, that's a pretty like wild thing to try to wrap your head around.
Yeah, it was cool. And it was also my first real exposure to like the career of science. This was mainly my sophomore year that I worked in this lab. And like I ended up getting like a paper that I like had done a lot of the data crunching for published, but like I did very little of writing that paper. and that was specifically about like iron sulfur compounds at pressures and temperatures similar to Mars's interior. And the reason that mattered is basically Mars is less dense than it should be if we're assuming it's made of the same stuff as the Earth.
Okay.
And they think that potentially iron sulfur compounds are like more abundant on Mars. Okay. But to know that, we would need to know like what are the density of iron sulfur compounds at Mars's pressures. Yeah, so we were trying to figure that out.
So create a model here on Earth to explain what's happening on Mars.
Exactly, and it was cool. I was doing space geology, but I was also seeing that like people who didn't matter, like me, and like the other, like there's one other undergrad who worked there and a number of grad students. We did all the whiz-bang science stuff and turned on the lasers and like at the synchrotron, that facility we had to go to at Argonne National Laboratory, like you rent beam time. It's really expensive to get time on that. So like you would get 24 hours and you would use all 24 hours. So I got the night shift and I would be like up at like 2 a.m. running like a giant laser to like explore the inside of Mars. And it was a dream. But meanwhile, my professor, Andy, was like writing a grant proposal, applying for more money. Occasionally he'd come in and be like, that laser's gonna explode. And I'd be like, oh dang, thanks Andy. But he didn't seem like he was having as much fun as I was having. And if I was gonna be on that career path, I was gonna end up being him eventually.
And it's not really plausible to stay doing the whiz-bang science, because like, correct me if I'm wrong, you probably weren't getting paid for doing what you were doing.
No, I was not.
Yeah, I've been on that side of the road too.
Yeah.
It's like having fun doing science, but it's kind of because you enjoy it, not really because you're doing it for a career.
And like, I also found myself not quite as interested in like some of how abstract what we were doing was. There's a lot of leap you have to do, yeah, to get from like I would spend probably the bulk of my time trying to put the material that we were trying to study into this hole that's like so small you can only see it under a very powerful microscope. And how you would do it is you would just pick up the material. It's so small that it would just get statically attracted to the end of a needle, like a sewing needle. And you would just kind of gently try to nudge it into the hole. And it takes hours.
Yeah.
It literally takes like 2 or 3 hours before it'll like, because it'll just miss. It'll just miss every time. Because you move your hand like a fraction of a millimeter and you've crossed the entire field of view on your microscope.
Yeah. There's nothing you
like,
can do. Yeah, that sounds, oh God, that sounds tedious is what it sounds. You're really selling this whole science thing to our students here, Greg.
Well, what I realized was that maybe laboratory science wasn't as much for me.
Okay.
So my junior year, I went to the University Center in Svalbard because I had enough credits to graduate in 3 years.
And where's Svalbard?
Svalbard's the world's northernmost inhabited place. It's at about 88 degrees north latitude. I was specifically in the town of Longyearbyen. The island's about the size of the state of Maine. Government is shared between Norway and Russia, but it's also kind of got its own rules. So like after 6 months there, you're legally a resident. So I was legally a resident. I was allowed to shoot 2 reindeer a year. Yes, reindeer are real. I didn't, but they are tasty.
Thanks for clarifying both points.
And yeah, there I was taking a couple classes, but I was also doing what I discovered over the past couple of years was the science stuff I was really, really into, which was field work. And it turns out I liked stuff on Earth a lot more than I thought. And
so just to clarify for anyone listening, lab work, you're in a lab, you're shooting lasers, you're messing with things.
You're pushing the little thing into the hole.
You're doing, you're crunching numbers, you're working with spreadsheets. We've both done this. What I haven't done a lot of, and what you've done a lot more of, is field work, where you leave the laboratory, you go into the real world, you watch real science happening in like the natural world. So that's where you ended up in Svalbard.
The thing I ended up being really passionate about, and the thing that I would have ended up doing if I became a research scientist, was pretty much what, if anybody who had me last year is listening, like what y'all did for your final project, reconstructing Earth's history, looking at strata, those layers in different outcrops, different cliffs around different localities on Earth, and kind of reading it like a book and using the kind of rocks you find in each layer to reconstruct the Earth's history. Specifically, that's, I think, really interesting to do in the Arctic, and like the reason I focused on it in the Arctic, because the very recent history of the Arctic, that's a place where 130,000 years ago, there was a bunch of ice, and now there's less of it. And right now we're going through a time period in our history where there's some ice, and there's suddenly starting to be a lot less of it. So it's really important we understand the last time that happened.
Yeah.
And that's what my research was about. So basically I would go out into like the Arctic. We would go on like these little rubber boats and put on these ridiculous, like, in case you fall in the water costumes. We looked like little, we looked like the guys from Among Us. I didn't know this at the time, but we had like, we were all the orange guy from Among Us. You just had a little hole for your face to peek out. And then you would like take that thing off because you're wearing clothes under it, and you would go out into like a fjord in this alien place where there's no plant on this island that is bigger than 2 centimeters because it wouldn't survive the wind. And because of that, the wind is like, people would fall over. The wind is insane. The only animals that live there are polar bears, Arctic foxes, us, and this little dumb bird called a ptarmigan.
Must be really good at flying.
And the reindeers. No, the ptarmigans are terrible at flying. They're just these little chubby like things that just kind of walk around. You can just pick them up and eat them. You can. Okay. You're allowed to hunt them, but you don't got to shoot them. They don't know anything about people. People barely live here.
Did the polar bears train you while you were there?
No, the polar bears eat the seals. But yeah, I would go and we would find what are called erratic boulders. So basically, it's a field with nothing in it, and there's just a boulder that's so big, there's no way it could have gotten there unless a glacier moved it a long, long time ago. Mm-hmm. And we would take a diamond tip saw and saw off a chunk of the rock, take it back with us, and then make a really thin section that you could put under a microscope and just compare it to all of the known bedrock across the island. And when you've done that with enough samples, you can basically make a map of like, okay, this rock is clearly from this bedrock, so the glacier must have come this way. And once you've done that enough, you have like enough background data to make a computer model that has a realistic picture of how there's a New York happening outside. But like a realistic model of how the ice sheet functioned, so that then you can start modeling how it collapsed. So we can understand like stuff we don't know right now but need to know, like how long would it take for the Greenlandic ice sheet to collapse? Mm-hmm. Like how long do we got? How long do these processes take? You have to have a model of how it works first. So we were like helping build that up.
That's really cool. So that was during your junior year at U Chicago, studying abroad.
And that one I was paid.
Oh, big money.
Norwegian kroner. So actually very small money.
Okay. And if we had more time, I would have you tell the story about polar bears and falling through the ice. But we can make another video, maybe reprise this in a part 2. Because I want to move on to, so you junior year, you're in Svalbard, you come back and you finish your senior year at U Chicago. And at this point, are you still thinking, I want a career in geology? When was your head turning away from geology as a career and more toward like teaching or an alternate pathway?
Honestly, in Svalbard still. Like I was running away from polar bears and then getting on a boat and like zipping away at like high speeds in this alien place that like where life is just not a major geologic force. Yeah. It was as cool as science was ever going to get. And I still kind of had beef with it.
Yeah.
Like I was still doing that and running away from that polar bear to bring a chunk of rock back to my professor in her office.
So not as fulfilling as you thought it might be.
And more just like, yeah, like I could see that like there wasn't a version of this job where I would not get promoted out of doing the part of it I really loved.
Okay.
Um, and like there are other options for someone with a geology major. Like a lot of people from a lot of geology schools, not as much UChicago because so much of their stuff is about like space, but like a lot of people go into mining.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot that you need a geology degree to get into like finding oil or finding any other minerals in the earth.
Yeah,
Um,
mining, resource management, land management, stuff like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
but
A lot of times if you do go into those fields, you'd be going from something that's very free form, and what you described about what you loved about it was the whiz bang nature of being able to just do
yeah,
different things and experience really exciting stuff. um, but when you go into like land management or mining, you're then switching over into a highly regulated, highly structured field where
yeah,
all of that is kind of gone.
yeah, exactly. Like you're almost discouraged from coming up with new methods to do a thing because there are already methods that work and don't cost that much.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, my senior year, I didn't have that many more classes to take, so I had a lot of time to just kind of like think. And I realized like the part of I was simultaneously doing like volunteering in Chicago. This is gonna be mildly embarrassing potentially, but everybody knows the peer health exchange volunteers who come to our school and talk to the health classes. I did that. Um, and it was obviously terrible. Like everybody just like yelled the whole time while I was like trying to show people how to put on a condom. And like I still kind of really liked it. I liked explaining stuff. Um, I liked still getting the chance to talk about science concepts without like, and like knowing that like if I became a teacher, I could just keep talking about that.
You get to keep talking about what you love talking about.
Yeah, forever. And
Yeah.
I don't have to get promoted out of doing that.
I had a very so I have not done one of these interviews myself.
Mhm.
Perhaps maybe I'll turn the table and you can interview me one of these days.
Oh.
But I had a very similar experience to that, where in civil engineering I got to a point where I realized I was like, it's either time for me to go get a 9 to 5 job designing strip footings and basement foundations,
Right.
or I have to go get a PhD if I want to keep doing lab work and keep doing research. And the idea of spending another 3 to 4 years making no money being a PhD student, because I didn't really have any prospects, as like the school was not going to like hire me to be like
Yeah.
a full-time researcher or anything. So yeah, I had a very similar experience where I was doing TA work for undergrads, and I found myself spending all of my time either working on my own stuff in the lab or working with the undergrad students. And I
Yeah.
realized that I was just focusing on what I enjoyed doing, which turned out to be teaching. So I kind of had a very similar experience where I realized I was like, oh, I'm not wasting my time because I'm doing something that I love, but like the end game here isn't teaching, and that's really what it was engaging me.
Yeah. Yeah. Same.
Yeah.
So like I took 2 years in Chicago where I was like the first year I was teaching math in Chicago, I was totally like, this is just like to see if I like it more, but like I was still pretty sure I was going to go back into geology.
Mm-hmm.
And by the second year I was like hooked. I was like, no,
This is what we
I'm
do.
not going back.
Cool. Cool. So, so now everyone knows that you're a teacher.
Yes.
So, why do you like teaching? And why specifically do you think that teaching earth science is important? Why do you think that like this interview and us talking about our careers is important?
Um, I mean, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what science is, to answer your last question first. Um, and like, I don't want to like romanticize it as a career. Like, there's a reason we both didn't choose to get into it. But I do want to talk about like the pros and cons of it realistically. And like any job, it can turn into drudgery. And I think you have to be willing to accept that like you're playing a very small part in understanding something enormous, and your contribution's still meaningful, but like the individual contribution of a lifetime in science is often like not understood until long past you've done it.
Yeah.
Like long past the end of that lifetime. So I think that's why it's important to talk about like our experiences. And also to show that like you can still do cool lab stuff in college and go on crazy adventures and not become a scientist. Like I could have done all those things and not even thought I wanted to be a scientist, you know?
Yeah.
That option's available to you. In terms of like why I love teaching earth science, like I think there's two reasons. One is just it's so cool. Like
that's a good answer.
Like we just have access to ways to understand why the things that we see happening every day are happening. And like to piece together this really engaging puzzle from like the rock record of the earth and learn how to read it like a book and understand like this insane vast history of our planet. I think that's just, it's an inherently cool process. And why I think it's important, I mean, I think, like, not to get political, but to get a little political, our planet's not doing amazing right now.
This isn't really political. This is just like factual, like climate change is a thing.
To be true.
Like
yes, yes it is. But I'm from Kentucky. And I'm deeply bred.
Yeah. So dealing with like confronting the problem is political, but stating the facts are not political. So go ahead and state the facts about how you feel about climate change and that
Our
stuff.
climate is changing, and like the only way to understand the way, like the starting point of understanding climate change is understanding what's normal. And earth science is the study of, how does this planet normally work? And once you understand that, you can look around and be like, oh, crap.
That's
not good.
Supposed to be there.
It's not supposed to be happening.
What's carbon in the air for?
And I feel so blessed because the class that's about how we're messing that up and how to fix it, I also get to teach AP Environmental.
So it sounds like your head turned from earth science, from your career as a geologist, and you kind of changed career and changed pathways. It wasn't because you didn't like what you do, and it wasn't because you weren't fascinated with the subject matter, or you fell out of love with the earth. It was merely how can I have a bigger impact and how can I be more fulfilled personally while still engaging in what I love?
Yeah, I feel like, I don't really feel like I've changed projects.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm engaged in the same project I was when I was in Svalbard and at UChicago. And also I worked at a third lab that we're not going to talk about, and that's fine. I was basically a like cleaner of glassware and boiler of dirt. But yeah, I feel like I'm still engaged in the same project. This is just another end of that project.
Different side of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that's the natural stopping point of this. We've been talking for a while, so I'm gonna hit the stop record button. But before I do that, it's been a pleasure. I think that not often do students get to see this side of you, so this has been fun. Maybe we'll turn the tables and you get to interview me one of these days, and I'll share my history of how I got to where I am.
Sure.
And I will talk about Syracuse basketball as little as possible in the course of my life. And so thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your time on this late evening, and I'll let you know when I get this up.
Of course. Thanks, man.
Yeah.